Hey everybody, today I want to talk about two hidden problems with plugins that you should be looking out for whenever you're doing anything creative, sound design, mixing, recording, etc. These are the kinds of things that nobody really discusses too much when they're talking about what makes a plugin great and what makes it useful. There's a lot of time spent on, how easy is it to use and how pretty does it look and how does it sound and all that. But there are a couple of big caveats that can really make or break large sessions especially. Simple sessions generally don't have very many tracks in them, so you can get away with doing a lot of processing on just a few tracks. But when you're working on something like a larger, more complicated feature film or television show, sometimes you can have upwards of 3, 4, 500 tracks. Generally, when you're doing something like mixing, you're balancing all of your audio against everything else in your session, you're panning things around your space, especially if you're in the immersive environment, something like Dolby Atmos, you've got a whole lot of attention to detail going on, but also a whole lot of horsepower being used to manage a session like that. Now, every single audio file or every single clip in a timeline is probably going to get processed in some way, at least with an EQ and at least with a compressor. A lot of the time, you've got all kinds of different sounds playing back at any given time on any given track. You're going to have to process them all differently. This is done using automation, which I did another short video on. You can check it out at the link above if you want to know more. Basically, it's a way to get the plugins on your tracks as well as levels and panning and all that kind of adjustment to play back properly every single time whenever it is you're mixing. Now, some plugins actually have a lot of stuff going on under the hood. My favorite one to pick on for this is FabFilter's Pro Q. FabFilter Pro Q is probably my favorite standalone EQ plugin just because it's so intuitive to use. It's fast, it's easy, it sounds exactly the way that I want it to, it's reliable, it's consistent, all that great stuff. What makes it so flexible is that it's got 24 bands of EQ that you can use at any given time on up to 10 channels of audio. That's Dolby Atmos 7.1.2 support in just a single instance of this plugin, which is fantastic. However, if you break down each of those EQ points, which has bandwidth information and gain information and frequency information, as well as all the dynamic EQ stuff that they've built into the latest version, that can add up in a hurry. Let's stick with the Dolby Atmos example. If you've just got one 7.1.2 Dolby Atmos track, that's 10 channels on a single track, you add one FabFilter Pro Q plugin onto that track, that's 10 individual instances within that plugin of 24 bands of EQ, each with anywhere between 3 and 6 different parameters attached to each of those EQ bands. That's anywhere between 700 and 1400 different options and different automation lanes that your system is going to be having to read back and make sure there aren't any changes, or if there are, play those changes back in the mix on just that one plugin. Now, expand that out to a complex feature session where you've got, let's say, 1,000 tracks, and you've got an instance of FabFilter on every single one of those tracks. That's a lot of processing in one EQ plugin across all those different parameters. So your computer could get way bogged down with that stuff and you'd never even know it. The system resources actually wouldn't necessarily report that that's even going on, which was a big problem on a lot of large feature stages when FabFilter Pro Q2 came out. The solution to that with Pro Q, as well as any other plugin that was really resource intensive just when it came down to automation, was actually to scale back the complexity of that automation by disabling a lot of the parameters of those plugins. So instead of using all 24 bands at once or being able to use all 24 bands at once, a lot of mixers would scale it back to 10 bands, 8 bands, and just impose that sort of limitation on the plugin so you're not taxing the resources. If the automation lanes for every single band of EQ and all of their frequencies and all of their gains and all of their bandwidths are not being automated, computers aren't even going to read that information. They're not going to be looking for it. It's going to decrease the amount of processing necessary just to play back a session. The second issue comes into play once you've finished a mix and you're ready to deliver all of your audio to wherever it needs to go. Now, when you're working in film and television, you've got all kinds of complexity there. There's everything from mono and stereo comp downs of everything to stems and splits, as well as Dolby Atmos again in the mix. So there's all kinds of different file formats and deliverables that need to be generated. Now, generally what you have to do is print all that stuff separately. It used to be that you had to print final assets in real time. So playing back a song all the way down, playing back anything from a 10-second advertisement all the way out to an hour-and-a-half long feature film. You had to sit back in real time and just let the thing play down so it could print all your audio. And again, when you're dealing with, say, 10 different deliverable formats, it's going to be pretty time consuming and complicated. These days, Not only is there no time to wait for that kind of stuff, we also have offline processing if you're working entirely in the box. So you can render things out 3 and 5 and 10 times faster than they'd ordinarily play back in real time. Now, some plugins take a lot longer to offline bounce if they're using more intense system resources. Even if they play back totally normally, there's no latency or anything like that. When you go to render everything, there's so much going on under the hood that it actually can easily double, triple, or even quadruple the amount of time that you're going to spend rendering your audio offline. The plugin that I found this with most recently was Harrison's MPC plugin. Now, this is not a plugin for the faint of heart. This is the direct code off of the large format Harrison MPC 5 console for feature film mixing and television mixing. And this is a pretty serious plugin at $1,500 for an instance of it. Now, I love what it does. I think it's an awesome plugin. It's a little tough to look at to some degree, but I love the EQ. It's a great integrated channel strip. The denoiser sounds fantastic on dialogue. Love it all the way. FabFilter, by comparison, you'd have to pick up multiple other plugins to match the capabilities. They don't have a denoising plugin yet, so I guess there's not really any direct comparison there. It'd be a lot cheaper. It wouldn't have quite all the bells and whistles, but it's a pretty solid package all the way around. I really like the MPC, but when you're going to offline bounce and you've got, again, as a channel strip plugin, let's say 200 or 300 instances of this thing here, it's got a lot of processing time under the hood that you don't realize is there until you go to render all your final audio. And it easily took 3-4 times longer to do that than some of the Fab stuff that I was using before. Now, that may or may not be a good thing or a bad thing, depends on how much time you have, of course. But if you're generating a lot of deliverables, if you're bouncing around from project to project every day and you need to render something out, jump into something else immediately and keep going quickly, that's going to be a factor. And you don't really realize it again until you're at the very tail end of the pipeline. You've already got all your mixing done, and then you have to render it and it takes 4 or 5 times longer than maybe it should. That can be an issue. So I think it's really important with this kind of stuff. This is why you try plugins before you really get into them. This is why you kind of see how they fit into your workflow before you get attached to them. I love new stuff just as much as anybody else, and I think there's a lot of great plugins out there that are doing some really, really cool stuff. But I can't navigate away from certain things because there are all these weird little tricks and kind of nuances that don't show themselves until you're under the gun. You have to do something really fast. You've done it 1,000 times, and suddenly a wrench gets thrown into everything because of something like this. So I know this was a little bit more technical, a little more complicated of a video, but as this kind of content starts being more common, people are getting in Dolby Atmos and immersive environments, and that kind of content gets created more. These are all going to be things you're going to have to start paying attention to, especially when it comes to larger, more complicated, and more professional sessions. So hopefully this all makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. Don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe. I'm over on Instagram at AXK, so come follow me over there. And as always, thanks for watching.